Sun Tzu's On the Art of War. Recorded by Kairos of the Threefold Manifold. June 25th, 2025. Part 1. The oldest military treatise in the world. Translated from the Chinese with introduction and critical notes. By Lionel Giles, M.A. Assistant in the Department of Oriental Printed Books and MSS, in the British Museum. London, Luzak & Co., 1910. Printed by E.J. Bill, Leiden, Holland. To my brother, Captain Valentine Giles, R.G., in the hopes that a work 2,400 years old may yet contain lessons worth consideration by the soldier of today. This translation is affectionately dedicated. Preface. The 7th volume of Memoirs Concerning the History, Sciences, Arts, Customs, Habits, etc. of the Chinese is devoted to the art of war and contains, amongst other treatises, the 13 Articles of Sun Tzu, translated from the Chinese by a Jesuit father, Joseph Amiot. Père Amiot appears to have enjoyed no small reputation as a sinologue in his day, and the field of his labors was certainly extensive, but his so-called translation of Sun Tzu, if placed side by side with the original, is seen at once to be little better than an imposture. It contains a great deal that Sun Tzu did not write, and very little indeed of what he did. Here is a fair specimen, taken from the opening sentences of Chapter 5. On skill in the government of troops. Sun Tzu said, "Have the names of all officers, both generals and subalterns. Write them down in a separate catalogue, with the note of the talents and capacities of each of them, so that you can employ them to advantage when the opportunity arises. Make sure that all those you are to command are convinced that your main intention is to preserve them from all harm. The troops you send against the enemy must be like stones that you throw against eggs. From you to the enemy, there should be no other difference than that of the strong to the weak, of the empty to the full. Attack openly, but win in secret. This, in a few words, is what skill and perfection in the government of troops consist of." Throughout the 19th century, which saw a wonderful development in the study of Chinese literature, no translator ventured to tackle Sun Tzu, although his work was known to be highly valued in China as by far the oldest and best compendium of military science. It was not until the year 1905 that the first English translation by Captain E. F. Calthrop, RFA, appeared at Tokyo under the title Son Shi, the Japanese form of Sun Tzu. Unfortunately, it was evident that the translator's knowledge of Chinese was far too scanty to fit him to grapple with the manifold difficulties of Sun Tzu. He himself plainly acknowledges that without the aid of 2 Japanese gentlemen, the accompanying translation would have been impossible. We can only wonder, then, that with their help it should have been so excessively bad. It is not merely a question of downright blunders from which none can hope to be wholly exempt. Omissions were frequent. Hard passages were willfully distorted or slurred over. Such offenses are less pardonable. They would not be tolerated in any edition of a Greek or Latin classic, and a similar standard of honesty ought to be insisted upon in translations from Chinese. From blemishes of this nature, at least, I believe that the present translation is free. It was not undertaken out of any inflated estimate of my own powers, but I could not help feeling that Sun Tzu deserved a better fate than had befallen him, and I knew that, at any rate, I could hardly fail to improve on the work of my predecessors. Towards the end of 1908, a new and revised edition of Captain Calthrop's translation was published in London, this time, however, without any allusion to his Japanese collaborators. My first 3 chapters were then already in the printer's hands, so that the criticisms of Captain Calthrop therein contained must be understood as referring to his earlier edition. In the subsequent chapters, I have of course transferred my attention to the second edition. This is on the whole an improvement on the other, though there still remains much that cannot pass muster. Some of the grosser blunders have been rectified and lacunae filled up, but on the other hand, a certain number of new mistakes appear. The very first sentence of the introduction is startlingly inaccurate, and later on, while mention is made of an army of Japanese commentators on Sun Tzu, who are these, by the way? Not a word is vouchsafed about the Chinese commentators, who, nevertheless, I venture to assert, form a much more numerous and infinitely more important army. A few special features of the present volume may now be noticed. In the first place, the text has been cut up into numbered paragraphs, both in order to facilitate cross-reference and for the convenience of students generally. The division broadly follows that of Sun Xingyan's edition, but I have sometimes found it desirable to join two or more of his paragraphs into one. In quoting from other words, Chinese writers seldom give more than the bare title by way of reference, and the task of research is apt to be seriously hampered in consequence. With a view to obviating this difficulty, so far as Sun Tzu is concerned, I have also appended a complete concordance of Chinese characters, following in this the admirable example of Ledge, though an alphabetical arrangement has been preferred to the distribution under radicals which he adopted. Another feature borrowed from the Chinese classics is the printing of text, translation, and notes on the same page. The notes, however, are inserted according to the Chinese method, immediately after the passages to which they refer. From the mass of native commentary, my aim has been to extract the cream only, adding the Chinese text here and there when it seemed to present points of literary interest. Though constituting in itself an important branch of Chinese literature, very little commentary of this kind has hitherto been made directly accessible by translation. I may say in conclusion that, owing to the printing off of my sheets as they were completed, the work has not had the benefit of a final revision. On a review of the whole, without modifying the substance of my criticisms, I might have been inclined in a few instances to temper their asperity. Having chosen to wield a bludgeon, however, I shall not cry out if, in return, I am visited with more than a rap over the knuckles. Indeed, I have been at some pains to put a sword into the hands of future opponents by scrupulously giving either text or reference for every passage translated. A scathing review, even from the pen of the Shanghai critic who despises mere translations, would not, I must confess, be altogether unwelcome. For, after all, the worst fate I shall have to dread is that which befell the ingenious paradoxes of George in The Vicar of Wakefield. Introduction. Sun Wu and his book. Sima Qian gives the following biography of Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu Wu was a native of the Qi state. His art of war brought him to the notice of Ho Lu, king of Wu. Ho Lu said to him, "I have carefully perused your 13 chapters. May I submit your theory of managing soldiers to a slight test?" Sun Tzu replied, "You may." Ho Lu asked, "May the test be applied to women?" The answer was again in the affirmative. So arrangements were made to bring out 180 ladies out of the palace. Sun Tzu divided them into 2 companies and placed one of the king's favorite concubines at the head of each. He then bade them all take spears in their hands and addressed them thus: "I presume you know the difference between front and back, right hand and left hand." The girls replied, "Yes." Sun Tzu went on, "When I say eyes front, you must look straight ahead. When I say left turn, you must face towards your left hand. When I say right turn, you must face towards your right hand. When I say about turn, you must face right round towards the back." Again the girls assented. The words of command having been thus explained, he set up the halberds and battle-axes in order to begin the drill. Then, to the sound of drums, he gave the order, "Right turn," but the girls only burst out laughing. Sun Tzu said, "If words of command are not clear and distinct, if orders are not thoroughly understood, then the general is to blame." He started drilling them again, and this time gave the orders, "Left turn," whereupon the girls once more burst into fits of laughter. Sun Tzu said, "If words of command are not clear and distinct, if orders are not thoroughly understood, the general is to blame. But if his orders are clear, and the soldiers nevertheless disobey, then it is the fault of their officers. So saying, he ordered the leaders of the two companies to be beheaded. Now the king of Wu was watching the scene from the top of a raised pavilion, and when he saw that his favorite concubines were about to be executed, he was greatly alarmed and hurriedly sent down the following message. We are now quite satisfied as to our general's ability to handle troops. If we are bereft of these two concubines, our meat and drink will lose their savor. It is our wish that they shall not be beheaded. Sun Tzu replied, having once received His Majesty's commission to be the general of his forces, there are certain commands of His Majesty which, acting in that capacity, I am unable to accept. Accordingly, he had the two leaders beheaded, and straightway installed the pair next in order as leaders in their place. When this had been done, the drum was sounded for the drill once more, and the girls went through all the evolutions, turning to the right or to the left, marching ahead or wheeling back, kneeling or standing, with perfect accuracy and precision, not venturing to utter a sound. Then Sun Tzu sent a messenger to the king, saying, Your soldiers, sire, are now properly drilled and disciplined, and ready for your majesty's inspection. They can be put to any use that their sovereign may desire. Bid them go through fire and water, and they will not disobey. But the king replied, Let our generals cease drilling and return to camp. As for us, we have no wish to come down and inspect the troops. Thereupon Sun Tzu said, The king is only fond of words, and cannot translate them into deeds. After that, Holu saw that Sun Tzu was one who knew how to handle an army, and finally appointed him general. In the west, he defeated the Chu state and forced his way into Ying, the capital. To the north, he put fear into the states of Qi and Qin, and spread his fame abroad amongst the feudal princes. And Sun Tzu shared in the might of the king. About Sun Tzu himself, this is all that Sima Qian has to tell us in this chapter. But he proceeds to give a biography of his descendant, Sun Bin, born about 100 years after his famous ancestor's death, and also the outstanding military genius of his time. The historian speaks of him too as Sun Tzu, and in his preface we read, Sun Tzu had his feet cut off, and yet continued to discuss the art of war. It seems likely, then, that Bin was a nickname bestowed on him after his mutilation, unless indeed the story was invented in order to account for the name. The crowning incident of his career, the defeat of his treacherous rival, Pang Chuan, will be found briefly related on page 40. To return to the elder Sun Tzu, he is mentioned in two other passages of the Shichi. In the 3rd year of his reign, 512 BC, Holu, king of Wu, took the field with Zhu Chu, Ide, Yu Xuan, and Bo Pei, and attacked Chu. He captured the town of Shu, and slew the two princes' sons who had formerly been generals of Wu. He was then meditating a descent on Ying, the capital. But the general Sun Wu said, The army is exhausted. It is not yet possible. We must wait. After further successful fighting, in the 9th year, 506 BC, King Holu of Wu addressed Wu Jushu and Sun Wu, saying, Formerly, you declared that it was not yet possible for us to enter Ying. Is the time ripe now? The two men replied, Chu's general, Qi Cheng, is grasping and covetous, and the princes of Tang and Sai both have a grudge against him. If your majesty has resolved to make a grand attack, you must win over Tang and Sai, and then you may succeed. Holu followed this advice, beat Chu in 5 pitched battles, and marched into Ying. This is the latest date at which anything is recorded of Sun Wu. He does not appear to have survived his patron, who died from the effects of a wound in 496. In the chapter entitled Liu Shu, the earlier portion of which M. Chavan believes to be a fragment of a treatise on military weapons, there occurs this passage. From this time onwards, a number of famous soldiers arose, one after the other. Gao Fan, who was employed by the Qin state, Wang Ji in the service of Qi, and Sun Wu in the service of Wu. These men developed and threw light upon the principles of war. It is obvious that Sima Qian at least had no doubt about the reality of Sun Wu as an historical personage, and with one exception to be noticed presently, he is by far the most important authority on the period in question. It will not be necessary, therefore, to say much of such a work as Wu Yue Chunqiu, which is supposed to have been written by Zhao Ye of the 1st century AD. The attribution is somewhat doubtful, but even if it were otherwise, his account would be of little value, based as it is on the Shi Che, and expanded with romantic details. The story of Sun Tzu will be found, for what it is worth, in Chapter 2. The only new points in it worth noting are 1. Sun Tzu was first recommended to Ho Lu by Wu Zichu. 2. He is called a native of Wu. 3. He had previously lived a retired life, and his contemporaries were unaware of his ability. The following passage occurs in Huainan Zi. When sovereign and ministers show perversity of mind, it is impossible even for a Sun Tzu to encounter the foe. Assuming that this work is genuine, and hitherto no doubt has been cast upon it, we have here the earliest direct reference to Sun Tzu, for Huainan Ji died in 122 BC, many years before the Shi Che was given to the world. Liu Xing, BC 80-9, in his Xin Xiu, completed in 1134, informs us that the surname Sun was bestowed on Sun Wu's grandfather by Jing Gung, Duke Qing of Qi, 547-490 BC. Sun Wu's father, Sun Feng Ping, rose to be a minister of state in Qi, and Sun Wu himself, whose style was Chongqing, fled to Wu on account of the rebellion which was being fomented by the kindred of Tin Bao. He had 3 sons, of whom the second, named Ming, was the father of Sun Pin. According to this account, then, Pin was the grandson of Wu, which, considering that Sun Pin's victory over Wei was gained in 341 BC, may be dismissed as chronologically impossible. Whence these data were obtained by Dongming Shi, I do not know, but of course, no reliance whatever can be placed in them. An interesting document which has survived from the close of the Han period is the short preface written by the great Cao Cao, or Wei Wu Di, for his edition of Sun Tzu. I shall give it in full. I have heard that the ancients used bows and arrows to their advantage. The Liun Yu says, there must be a sufficiency of military strength. The Shu Jing mentions the army among the 8 objects of government. The I Ching says, Shi, army, indicates firmness and justice. The experienced leader will have good fortune. The Chi Ching says, the king rose majestic in his wrath, and he marshaled his troops. The Yellow Emperor, Tong the Completer, and Wu Wang all used spears and battle axes in order to succor their generation. The Suma Fa says, if one man slay another of set purpose, he himself may rightfully be slain. He who relies solely on warlike measures shall be exterminated. He who relies solely on peaceful measures shall perish. Instances of this are Fu Chai on the one hand, and Yin Wang on the other. In military matters, the sage's rule is normally to keep the peace, and to move his forces only when occasion requires. He will not use armed force, unless driven to it by necessity. Many books have I read on the subject of war and fighting, but the work composed by Sun Wu is the profoundest of them all. Sun Wu was a native of the Qi state. His personal name was Wu. He wrote The Art of War in 13 chapters for Ho Lu, king of Wu. Its principles were tested on women, and he was subsequently made a general. He led an army westwards, crushed the Chu state, and entered Ying, the capital. In the north, he kept Qi and Qin in awe. 100 years and more after his time, Sun Pin lived. He was a descendant of Wu. In his treatment of deliberation and planning, the importance of rapidity in taking the field, clearness of conception, and depth of design, Sun Tzu stands beyond the reach of carping criticism. My contemporaries, however, have failed to grasp the full meaning of his instructions, and while putting into practice the smaller details in which his work abounds, they have overlooked its essential purport. That is the motive which has led me to outline a rough explanation of the whole. One thing to be noticed in the above is the explicit statement that the 13 chapters were specially composed for King Ho Lu. This is supported by the internal evidence of 1, subsection 15, in which it seems clear that some ruler is addressed. In the bibliographical section of the Han Shu, there's an entry which has given rise to much discussion. The works of Sun Tzu of Wu in 82 pian, or chapters, with diagrams and 9 zhuan. It is evident that this cannot be merely the 13 chapters known to Sima Qian, or those we possess today. Zhang Shuojie, in his Shiji Zhongye, refers to an edition of Sun Tzu's Bingfa, of which the 13 chapters formed the first zhuan, adding that there were 2 other zhuan besides. This has brought forth a theory that the bulk of these 82 chapters consisted of other writings of Sun Tzu, we should call them apocryphal, similar to the Wen Da, of which a specimen dealing with the 9 situations is preserved in the Tong Din, and another in He Shi's commentary. It is suggested that before his interview with Ho Lu, Sun Tzu had only written the 13 chapter words, but afterwards composed a sort of exegesis in the form of question and answer between himself and the king. Bi Yi Shun, author of the Wunzi Xiu Lu, backs this up with a quotation from the Wu Yue Chun Qiu. The king of Wu summoned Sun Tzu and asked him questions about the art of war. Each time he set forth a chapter of his work, and the king could not find words enough to praise him. As he points out, if the whole work was expounded on the same scale as in the above-mentioned fragments, the total number of chapters could not fail to be considerable. Then the numerous other treatises attributed to Sun Tzu might also be included. The fact that the Han Shi mentions no work of Sun Tzu except the 82 pian, whereas the Sui and Tong bibliographies give the titles of others in addition to the 13 chapters, is a good proof. Bi Yi Shun thinks that all of these were contained in the 82 pian. Without pinning our faith to the accuracy of the details supplied by the Wu Yue Chun Qiu, or admitting the genuineness of any of the treatises cited by Bi Yi Shun, we may see in this theory a probable solution of the mystery. Between Sima Qian and Ban Ku, there was plenty of time for a luxuriant crop of forgeries to have grown up under the magic name of Sun Tzu, and the 82 pian may very well represent a collected edition of these lumped together with the original work. It is also possible, though less likely, that some of them existed in the time of the earlier historian and were purposely ignored by him. Du Mu, after Cao Gong, the most important commentator on Sun Tzu, composed the preface to his edition about the middle of the 9th century. After a somewhat lengthy defense of the military art, he comes at last to Sun Tzu himself, and makes 1 or 2 very startling assertions. The writings of Sun Wu, he says, originally comprised several 100,000 words, but Cao Cao, the Emperor Wu Wei, pruned away all redundancies and wrote out the essence of the whole so as to form a single book in 13 chapters. He goes on to remark that Cao Cao's commentary on Sun Tzu leaves a certain proportion of difficulties unexplained. This, in Du Mu's opinion, does not necessarily imply that he was unable to furnish a complete commentary. According to the Wei Chi, Cao himself wrote a book on war in something over 100,000 words, known as the Xin Shu. It appears to have been of such exceptional merit that he suspects Cao to have used it for the surplus material which he had found in Sun Tzu. He concludes, however, by saying, "The Xin Shu is now lost, so that the truth cannot be known for certain." Du Mu's conjectures seems to be based on a passage in the Wei Wu Di strung together with Sun Wu's Art of War, which in turn may have resulted from a misunderstanding of the final words of Zhao Gung's preface. Gu Zhuan Wei, Liu Jie Yin. This, as Sun Xing Yin points out, is only a modest way of saying that he made an explanatory paraphrase, or in other words, wrote a commentary on it. On the whole, the theory has met with very little acceptance. Thus, the Chu Ku Chuan Chu says, "The mention of the 13 chapters in the Shi Chu shows that they were in existence before the Han Chu, and that later accretions are not to be considered part of the original work. Du Mu's assertion can certainly not be taken as proof. There is every reason to suppose, then, that the 13 chapters existed in the time of Sima Qian practically as we have them now. That the work was then well known, he tells us in so many words. Sun Tzu's 13 chapters and Wu Qi's Art of War are the two books that people commonly refer to on the subject of military matters. Both of them are widely distributed, so I will not discuss them here. But as we go further back, serious difficulties begin to arise. The salient fact which has to be faced is that the Zhua Chuan, the great contemporary record, makes no mention whatever of Sun Wu, either as general or as a writer. It is natural in view of this awkward circumstance that many scholars should not only cast doubt on the story of Sun Wu as given in the Shi Chu, but even show themselves frankly skeptical as to the existence of the man at all. The most powerful presentiment of this side of the case is to be found in the following disquisition by Ye Shui-sin. It is stated in Sima Qian's history that Sun Wu was a native of the Qi state and employed by Wu, and that in the reign of He Lu, he crushed Chu, entered Ying, and was a great general. But in Sou's commentary, no Sun Wu appears at all. It is true that Sou's commentary need not contain absolutely everything that other histories contain, but Sou has not omitted to mention vulgar plebeians and hireling ruffians, such as Ying Kao Chu, Cao Gui, Zhu Jir Wu, and Chuan Che Ju. In the case of Sun Wu, whose fame and achievements were so brilliant, the omission is much more glaring. Again, details are given, in their particular order, about his contemporaries, Wu Yuan and the minister Pei. Is it credible that Sun Wu alone should have been passed over? In point of literary style, Sun Tzu's work belongs to the same school as Quan Tzu, the Liu Tao, and the Yue Yu, and may have been the production of some private scholar living towards the end of the spring and autumn, or the beginning of the Warring States period. The story that his precepts were actually applied by the Wu state is merely the outcome of big talk on the part of his followers. From the flourishing period of the Zhou dynasty down to the time of the spring and autumn, all military commanders were statesmen as well, and the class of professional generals for conducting external campaigns did not then exist. It was not until the period of the Six States that this custom changed. Now, although Wu was an uncivilized state, is it conceivable that Sou should have left unrecorded the fact that Sun Wu was a great general and yet held no civil office? What we are told, therefore, about Zhang Chu and Sun Wu is not authentic matter, but the reckless fabrication of theorizing pundits. The story of Ho Lu's experiment on the women, in particular, is utterly preposterous and incredible. Ye Shui-sin represents Sima Qian as having said that Sun Wu crushed Chu and entered Ying. This is not quite correct. No doubt the impression left on the reader's mind is that he at least shared in these exploits, but the actual subject of the verbs, ho, to break or destroy, ru, to enter, wei, power or prestige, and jian, to show or manifest, is certainly hei lu, to close or to shut, a hut or cottage, as is shown by the next words. Sun Tzu, Yu, Yo Li Yin, Sun Tzu, and those who are powerful. The fact may or may not be significant, but it is nowhere explicitly stated in the Shi Chu either that Sun Tzu was general on the occasion of the taking of Ying, or that he even went there at all. Moreover, as we know that Wu Yuan and Po Pei both took part in the expedition, and also that its success was largely due to the dash and enterprise of Fu Gai, Po Lu's younger brother, it is not easy to see how yet another general could have played a very prominent part in the same campaign. Qin Jin Sun of the Sung dynasty has the note. Military writers look upon Sun Wu as the father of their art, but the fact that he does not appear in the So Tuan, although he is said to have served under Ho Lu, king of Wu, makes it uncertain what period he really belonged to. He also says, the works of Sun Wu and Wu Qi may be of genuine antiquity. It is noticeable that both Ye Shui Sin and Qin Jin Sun, while rejecting the personality of Sun Wu, as he figures in Sima Qian's history, are inclined to accept the date traditionally assigned to the work which passes under his name. The author of the Xiu Lu fails to appreciate this distinction, and consequently, his bitter attack on Qin Jin Sun really misses its mark. He makes one or two points, however, which certainly tell in favor of the high antiquity of our 13 chapters. Sun Tzu, he says, must have lived in the age of Qing Wang, 519 through 476, because he is frequently plagiarized in subsequent works of the Zhou, Qin, and Han dynasties. The two most shameless offenders in this respect are Wu Qi and Huainan Zhu, both of them important historical personages in their day. The former lived only a century after the alleged date of Sun Tzu, and his death is known to have taken place in 381 BC. It was to him, according to Liu Sheng, that Zhang Qin delivered the Zhou Chuan, which had been entrusted to him by its author. Now, the fact that quotations from The Art of War, acknowledged or otherwise, are to be found in so many authors of different epochs establishes a very strong probability that there was some common source anterior to them all. In other words, that Sun Tzu's treatise was already in existence towards the end of the 5th century BC. Further proof of Sun Tzu's antiquity is furnished by the archaic or wholly obsolete meanings attaching to a number of the words he uses. A list of these, which might perhaps be extended, is given in the Xiu Lu, and though some of the interpretations are doubtful, the main argument is hardly affected thereby. Again, it must not be forgotten that Ye Shui Sin, a scholar and critic of the first rank, deliberately pronounces the style of the 13 chapters to belong to the early part of the 5th century. Seeing that he is actually engaged in an attempt to disprove the existence of Sun Wu himself, we may be sure that he would not have hesitated to assign the work to a later date had he not honestly believed the contrary. And it is precisely on such a point that the judgment of an educated Chinaman will carry most weight. Other internal evidence is not far to seek. Thus, in 13, subsection 1, there is an unmistakable allusion to the ancient system of land tenure, which had already passed away by the time of Mencius, who was anxious to see it revived in a modified form. The only warfare Sun Tzu knows is that carried on between the various feudal princes, in which armored chariots play a large part. Their use seems to have entirely died out before the end of the Zhou dynasty. He speaks as a man of Wu, a state which ceased to exist as early as 473 BC. On this I shall touch presently. But once refer the work to the 5th century or earlier, and the chances of its being other than a bona fide production are sensibly diminished. The great age of forgeries did not come until long after. That it should have been forged in the period immediately following 473 is particularly unlikely, for no one, as a rule, hastens to identify himself with a lost cause. As for Ye Shui Sin's theory, that the author was a literary recluse, that seems to be quite untenable. If one thing is more apparent than another after reading the maxims of Sun Tzu, it is that their essence has been distilled from a large store of personal observation and experience. They reflect the mind, not only of a born strategist, gifted with a rare faculty of generalization, but also of a practical soldier closely acquainted with the military conditions of his time. To say nothing of the fact that these sayings have been accepted and endorsed by all the greatest captains of Chinese history, they offer a combination of freshness and sincerity, acuteness and common sense, which quite excludes the idea that they were artificially concocted in the study. If we admit, then, that the 13 chapters were the genuine production of a military man living towards the end of the Chun Chu period, are we not bound, in spite of the silence of the Tso Chuan, to accept Sima Qian's account in its entirety? In the view of his high repute as a sober historian, must we not hesitate to assume that the records he drew upon for Sun Wu's biography were false and untrustworthy? The answer, I fear, must be in the negative. There is still one grave, if not fatal, objection to the chronology involved in the story as told in the Shi Chu, which, so far as I am aware, nobody has yet pointed out. There are 2 passages in Sun Tzu in which he alludes to contemporary affairs. The first is in 6, subsection 21. Though according to my estimate, the soldiers of Yue exceed our own in number, that shall advantage them nothing in the matter of victory. I say then that victory can be achieved. The other is in 11, subsection 30. Asked if an army can be made to imitate the Shui Zhan, I should answer, yes, for the men of Wu and the men of Yue are enemies. Yet, if they are crossing a river in the same boat and are caught by a storm, they will come to each other's assistance, just as the left hand helps the right. These 2 paragraphs are extremely valuable as evidence of the date of composition. They assign the work to the period of the struggle between Wu and Yue. So much has been observed by B. E. Shun. But what has hitherto escaped notice is that they also seriously impair the credibility of Sima Qian's narrative. As we have seen above, the first positive date given in connection with Sun Wu is 512 BC. He is then spoken of as a general, acting as confidential advisor to Ho Lu, so that his alleged introduction to that monarch had already taken place, and of course, the 13 chapters must have been written earlier still. But at that time, and for several years after, down to the capture of Ying in 506, Chu, and not Yue, was the great hereditary enemy of Wu. The 2 states, Chu and Wu, had been constantly at war for over half a century, whereas the first war between Wu and Yue was waged only in 510, and even then was no more than a short interlude sandwiched in the midst of the fierce struggle with Chu. Now Chu is not mentioned in the 13 chapters at all. The natural inference is that they were written at a time when Yue had become the prime antagonist of Wu. That is, after Chu had suffered the great humiliation of 506. At this point, a table of dates may be found useful. BC 514, accession of Ho Lu. 512. Ho Lu attacks Chu, but is dissuaded from entering Ying, the capital. Shi Chu mentions Sun Wu as general. 511. Another attack on Chu. 510. Wu makes a successful attack on Yue. This is the first war between the 2 states. 509 or 508. Chu invades Wu, but is finally defeated at Yu Cheng. 506. Ho Lu attacks Chu with the aid of Tong and Tsai. Decisive battle of O Chu and capture of Ying. Last mention of Sun Wu and Shi Che. 505. Yue makes a raid on Wu in the absence of its army. Wu is beaten by Qin and evacuates Ying. 504. Ho Lu sends Fu Chai to attack Chu. 497. Ko Jian becomes king of Yue. 496. Wu attacks Yue, but is defeated by Ko Jian. At Xiu Li, Ho Lu is killed. 494. Fu Chai defeats Ko Jian in the Great Battle of Fu Chao and enters the Capital War. 485 or 484. Ko Jian renders homage to Wu. Death of Wu Zushu. 482. Ko Jian invades Wu in the absence of Fu Chai. 478 to 476. Further attacks by Yue on Wu. 475. Ko Jian lays siege to the capital of Wu. 473. Final defeat and extinction of Wu. The sentence quoted above from 6 subsection 21 hardly strikes me as one that could have been written in the full flush of victory. It seems rather to imply that, for the moment at least, the tide had turned against Wu, and that she was getting the worst of the struggle. Hence we may conclude that our treatise was not in existence in 505, before which date Yue does not appear to have scored any notable success against Wu. Ho Lu died in 496, so that if the book was written for him, it must have been during the period of 505 through 496, when there was a lull in the hostilities, Wu presumably having been exhausted by its supreme effort against Chu. On the other hand, if we choose to disregard the tradition connecting Sun Wu's name with Ho Lu, it might equally well have seen the light between 496 and 494, or possibly in the period 482 through 473, when Yue was once again becoming a very serious menace. We may feel fairly certain that the author, whoever he may have been, was not a man of any great eminence in his own day. On this point, the negative testimony of the Sotuan far outweighs any shred of authority still attaching to the Shi Che, if once its other facts are discredited. Sun Xingyan, however, makes a feeble attempt to explain the omission of his name from the great commentary. It was Wu Jichu, he says, who got all the credit of Sun Wu's exploits, because the latter, being an alien, was not rewarded with an office in the state. How, then, did the Sun Tzu legend originate? It may be that the growing celebrity of the book imparted by degrees a kind of factitious renown to its author. It was felt to be only right and proper that one so well versed in the science of war should have solid achievements to his credit as well. Now, the capture of Ying was undoubtedly the greatest feat of arms in Ho Lu's reign. It made a deep and lasting impression on all the surrounding states, and raised Wu to the short-lived zenith of her power. Hence, what more natural, as time went on, than the acknowledged master of strategy, Sun Wu, should be popularly identified with that campaign, at first, perhaps, only in the sense that his brain conceived and planned it. Afterwards, that it was actually carried out by him in conjunction with Wu Yuan, Ho Pei, and Fu Kai. It is obvious that any attempt to reconstruct even the outline of Sun Tzu's life must be based almost wholly on conjecture. With this necessary proviso, I should say that he probably entered the service of Wu about the time of Ho Lu's accession, and gathered experience, though only in the capacity of a subordinate officer, during the intense military activity which marked the first half of that prince's reign. If he rose to be a general at all, he certainly was never on an equal footing with the three above mentioned. He was doubtless present at the investment and occupation of Ying, and witnessed Wu's sudden collapse in the following year. Yue's attack at this crucial juncture, when her rival was embarrassed on every side, seems to have convinced him that this upstart kingdom was the great enemy against whom every effort would henceforth have to be directed. Sun Wu was thus a well-seasoned warrior when he sat down to write his famous book, which, according to my reckoning, must have appeared towards the end rather than the beginning of Holu's reign. The story of the women may possibly have grown out of some real incident occurring about the same time. As we hear no more of Sun Wu after this from any source, he is hardly likely to have survived his patron, or to have taken part in the death struggle with Yue, which began with the disaster of Tsu Li. If these inferences are approximately correct, there is a certain irony in the fate which decreed that China's most illustrious man of peace should be contemporary with her greatest writer on war. I thank you all for joining us today. If you enjoyed, I hope that you find it worthwhile to give a little bit of feedback, a little bit of support in the form of sharing it to people who you think would also enjoy it, maybe subscribing if you would like to see more, and giving it a like or dislike depending on what you actually feel about it. If you want to get a steady feed of such content from the Threefold Manifold, you can find us at X, Twitter, Spotify, Instagram, Bitchute, and the Threefold Edifactory on Discord, all linked in the description. Alongside, if you think it might be monetarily worthwhile to support, helping us improve, get better, and maybe even make this something a lot more frequent and higher quality, then there is a one-time donation link that you can find through Streamelements, also in the description. Or if you want something a little bit more recurring, starting at $5, you can find us over at Patreon, also linked, and you can get some delightful features like participating in polls to help inform the direction and disposition of the channel, get your name listed at the start or end, depending on what you prefer, of every long-form piece of content like these streams, a few additional level-dependent only access to rooms and voice channels in our Discord, and otherwise my most permanent appreciation. But without further ado, I hope that you all never miss your opportunities.